So welcome everybody to today's webinar on the Urban Transitions Alliance and the focus of enabling equitable access to resources and services. My name is Rebecca Wessinghage, and I'm really happy to welcome all of our participants and speakers and the audience from the ICLEI World Secretariat side. This is actually the third webinar that we have in this collaboration with the Circular Turku project. Please, next slide. So in the first two sessions, we looked at different dimensions of our social equity framework. So the first webinar focused on city-business collaboration and the opportunity dimension. And the second webinar focused on the co-creation aspect together with local communities, so the participation dimension of our framework. And today we'll look into the access dimension, where we would kind of try to understand a bit better how to ensure that equitable access of our resources, services, and infrastructures can be advanced in a way that all population groups and all communities can have equitable access, not having any challenges or issues based on geographic location, based on demographic factors like age, gender, also language, and also finance or economic factors should not play a role. I very warmly welcome all of our Urban Transitions Alliance participants today. So we have our speakers, who is Oliver Kroner from the city of Cincinnati. We have Sebastian, formerly from the city of Essen, but also happy to have him representing today the Lala Ruhr. Then we have the city of Baltimore. We have the city of Glasgow. We have the city of Katowice. We have the Gelsenkirchen Science Park. We have the city of Turku. So a very warm welcome to you all. And next slide, please. We will have 3 interventions today. So as you can see from the agenda here, we will first hear from Oliver from the city of Cincinnati on inclusive public transport and addressing the energy burden. Sorry, this is actually kind of a working title. Ollie will updating us on the real title very soon. The second intervention from Sebastian will focus on enabling fair and green infrastructure access through local collaboration. And then we'll have an intervention from Matthew, my colleague from ICLEI Europe, on the 17 keys to unlock sustainable and just city. In the second half of the webinar, we'll have a question and discussion around 3 guiding questions for the day. So next slide, please. So we'll discuss on how to identify vulnerable groups that are at the risk of being excluded from resources, services, and infrastructures. We'll also try to understand a bit better how to address the risk in sustainability planning and identify and overcome barriers blocking access for these groups. And thirdly, we'll try to understand how to monitor actually access over time, because yeah, with all our interventions, specifically in the social equity field, it's sometimes very hard to track progress. And I think, yeah, it will be interesting to see how the interventions speakers will touch on these points. But also in the discussion part, we'll invite all of you to contribute from your own cities and activities background. Maybe as a last comment, I had initially expected a presentation from the city of Buffalo on the equitable COVID-19 response strategy in the city. Due to unforeseen sickness, we'll not have this presentation today, but we'll follow up with information and the slides a little bit later, so the content is not lost. Let me also thank my colleagues Unju and Ing from the Circular Development team in the ICLEI World Secretariat for supporting today's webinar. And now, without further ado, I'd like to give the word to Oliver Kroner from the city of Cincinnati. Ollie, we are happy to hear your presentation.
Thank you, Rebecca. Good to see everybody again. Hope to see some of you next week in person. Let me pull these up. Great. So yes, I will talk about public transit a little bit, but my talk this morning is a little bit broader in how we think about equity in our climate planning, and then touching on a handful of programs that are actually in operation now that are intended to address some of our inequities. So I really like the circular graphic that you shared, Rebecca. This is one of the graphics that we use that touches on some of the similar themes. When we think about equity in Cincinnati, there are three primary types that we try to focus on. One is recognition, sort of acknowledging that some of the inequities presented today are the direct result of governmental action in the past. I can give some examples of those, but acknowledging the role that government has played in creating inequity. Procedural, which I think was represented as participation in the graphic shared earlier. We want community voice at the table in the designing of policies, in the designing of programs, and there's much more intention around including those voices in governmentally appointed boards and commissions and city council. And then distribution, which I think is maybe the easiest to see, when we look at how environmental burdens are shared across our city, when we look at how programmatic resources are spent and delivered, the distribution is not always equitable. So I'll talk about all three of these components as they relate to the circular graphic that Rebecca shared. So diving into recognitional equity a little bit. I'm not sure how this translates to colleagues outside of the US, but in the US, many cities have a history of redlining, which I think has probably been talked about in different sessions along the way, but these were bank implemented zones within urban areas where financing was made easier in some pockets of the community and much harder in other pockets of the community. Those correlated very strongly with the racial makeup of those spaces. So today, when we look at home ownership rates and the demographics of those, our Black community is a much higher rental population than home ownership population. And it's a result of this policy from years ago. To make problems worse, in the 50s, the US launched their highway program, and many of those highways were designed to go directly through the communities that are zoned red here. So you had dense communities of people of color that were demolished, and highways went through them, dissecting the community, often cutting them off from the rest of the city, but forcing the community to scatter elsewhere. So we have these systemic issues that are stacked upon each other and create very real outcomes today. So I'll talk about how we're trying to correct some of those problems we have scripted into our current situation. And so when we attempt to analyze what this looks like today, last year we published our first ever climate equity indicators report, modeled somewhat after work done in Pittsburgh, where we looked at climate vulnerabilities, where we are seeing elevated levels of heat, where we are seeing more landslides, where we're seeing more flash flooding, and then how those compare to other socioeconomic equity variables, things like public health considerations and income considerations and levels of education. And this is the first time we've done this report, and we plan to conduct the analysis every 5 years, and it will be staggered with our climate action planning process. So this data set tees up our climate action planning in a way that gives us real equity metrics to begin to focus on and attempt to address. So to talk a little bit about procedural equity, our Green Cincinnati plan is our climate action plan, last updated in 2018. And as of last week, we are initiating our current update. It's really intended to be a community vision for a sustainable, equitable, resilient future for our city. And so that means a pretty robust engagement effort. We held over 30 public meetings around the city, collected over 1,400 recommendations from our residents, and then worked with NGOs, nonprofit organizations in the area to analyze them for climate impact, carbon reduction potential, and analyze those for cost benefit. At the time in 2018, we did have an equity advisor that served on our steering committee and gave us guiding principles. As we craft this process again moving forward, we'll have a much larger team focused on equity, developing an equity framework for consideration in the development of the process and the development of our goals and recommendations. And all in all, we distilled those 1,400 recommendations down to 80 strategies to reduce carbon 80% by 2050 and build towards a sustainable, equitable, resilient future. And in the development of this plan, with that extensive community engagement held across the city, held in different languages, we did our best to catalyze a collective impact model. So each of those individuals either represented a community or an organization. We asked those communities and organizations to put their names down next to different strategies in the plan to help make them happen. So we have over 40 different groups that have signed on as champions to help get the work done. And I don't know about you all, but our government is not real well funded. So we rely very heavily on these partnerships, inviting in-kind support to help get it done. And that has really been probably our central key to success along the way. So another form of procedural engagement. When we look at our climate equity indicators report, we can begin to understand how the climate crisis impacts different communities differently. So here, as an example, we led a citizen science campaign where we measured the urban heat islands within the city of Cincinnati. You can see the chart on the left. There's approximately 10 degrees Fahrenheit difference from one community to another in terms of heat, surface level heat experienced during a summer day. So already that gives us some sense of where we need to focus resources. When we pair that with how our urban tree canopy is scattered across the city, we see that some communities have a very healthy tree canopy while others have less than 10% canopy. And you notice the correlation between the deep red of the heat island map and the light green and the lack of canopy. So historically, we've had a 40% tree canopy target citywide. As this data comes forward and we disaggregate the data, we've now redefined our goals so that all residential communities have a 30% tree canopy minimum before we focus on planting elsewhere. When we look at energy, there was a study of major cities in the US that looked at energy burden, which is the percentage of a household's income spent on utilities. And in our low income population, Cincinnati here is top 10 worst in terms of energy burden along some of the peers, including some of the peers on the call. So we got to work thinking, how can we address this? And in Cincinnati, we have about 60% of our residents living in rental housing. And we have a very old building stock, maybe not as old as some of our European colleagues, but very old. And after a period of flight where people moved out of the city and disinvestment, as people move back to the city, many of these buildings are under cared for. And so in a typical US rental arrangement, you have a tenant who's responsible for the utility bill and a landlord who's responsible for all of the improvements and energy efficiency upgrades. So in that arrangement, there's no economic incentive to drive energy efficiency improvements. So over time, this gets worse and worse and worse. So we launched a program called Up Cincinnati, where we made some funding available through a few different channels. One, if you are a household experiencing energy poverty, you can come to us for free. We will do an energy audit of your space, and we can install energy efficiency improvements, whether that's weatherization, that's LED lighting, we can upgrade appliances. And if you, as a tenant, complete some educational materials, we will award you up to $500 energy credits on your bill to help cover your costs. That helps cover the tenant side of the equation, but we also have the landlords, the property owners. We have made matching grants available, where if you are a landlord renting to an individual suffering from energy poverty, we will match up to $5,000 of your energy efficiency upgrades. So that can pay for new appliances, that can upgrade heating, that can add insulation. We've almost cracked 400 units serviced through this program. We are negotiating with a nonprofit organization that has about 600 units in Cincinnati, all serving our low-income population, to deliver large-scale portfolio changes. In the US right now, there is a lot of federal infrastructure money coming online to be made available to help address some of these needs. So we're trying to position this program to compete for some of those funds. We've addressed 400, we have 34,000 units suffering from energy poverty. So that gives you some sense of the scale we're trying to reach. And then when we look at mobility, our data show that we have 1 in 4 Cincinnatians living without a car in a city that is fairly car dependent. You know, we don't have the bike infrastructure or the public transit infrastructure that some of our European colleagues have. On top of that, in the region, we've counted 70,000 jobs that are not accessible by public transit. So to begin to chip away at these problems, in 2020, there was a giant campaign to pass a transit levy. So we passed a sales tax that will increase the funding available to our regional transit system, $150 million annually. And it shifts it from a city tax to a county tax, which is a tax burden relief for our city residents. Also now allows us to fund a truly regional transit system to get to some of those jobs that are not necessarily within the city of Cincinnati, but within the region. We have a fairly robust bike share program in our urban core. Historically, all it took was a credit card, and you could pay for an annual membership or rent by the hour. And it didn't take long for the bike share operator to realize that low-income residents, particularly if they didn't have a credit card, weren't participating. So they designed a new program called the Go Pass, where it's just $5 a month, you get unlimited 2-hour rides over that 30-day period. And we've watched the participation in the bike share program skyrocket, so much so that we've been able to add electric bikes to the fleet. If you don't know, Cincinnati is very hilly, so electric bikes are critical to reach many neighborhoods, which also launched this whole bike delivery economy during COVID, as we saw shifts from in-restaurant dining to at-home dining. So entrepreneurs are now taking advantage of this new model. And then also in our downtown space, we have what is called the Cincinnati Bell Connector. It's a streetcar model that does a big figure 8 to connect some of the major attractions in the downtown space. Through COVID, ridership declined significantly, and we reached a point where it cost almost 80% of what we collected from the fare box to staff the fare box collection. So our elected leadership voted to make it free. And we've watched ridership increase month by month ever since. And actually last month recorded the highest ridership levels to date. And then lastly here, one of our new programs we call Climate Safe Neighborhoods, recognizing that, you know, we have subject matter experts who can talk at a high level about the way climate impact. The climate crisis will impact city government and city as a whole, but we can't really speak to how the climate crisis is impacting your house or your community. And so through Climate Safe, we've actually been able to raise funds to pay community members to participate in a 6-week workshop where we deep dive into the way the climate crisis is impacting them, their neighbors, their communities, and develop these community resilience maps. So this is one of Cincinnati's 52 neighborhoods, and the community members mapped out where tree planting could support urban heat issues, where additional bus stops or bus shelters could enhance the bus rider experience, where people gather during community events, during power outages, things like that. So let's just begin to fine tune and zoom in at a community level to design and implement solutions to address real people's needs and build relationships along the way. So this is a new program. We've done 3 neighborhoods. We're launching our 4th in 2 weeks. 52 neighborhoods is a lot when you do it a neighborhood by neighborhood like this, but we think this is a critical step to build these relationships and understand what community level resilience planning looks like. So our whole plan is available at greencincinnatiplan.org. As I mentioned, we are launching an update process right now, planning to send the updated document to City Council around this time next year. Thank you for the opportunity to share.
Thanks a lot, Ollie, for your intervention and the presentation. First of all, I think the breakdown of the equity into the 3, maybe not dimension, but aspects, were really inspiring to me, specifically the recognition part that is not so much reflected in our social equity framework. So that is something that we can maybe take away very strongly, that also this aspect is something we consider. And thanks also for sharing a little bit of insights into the different programs. Great to see that also there is the climate equity indicators report. I think you mentioned of the Pittsburgh model. So I think when we come to the monitoring question, there is already something that maybe you can contribute to the conversation in terms of what specific indicators you've been looking at. I think that's very interesting. And also across the different projects like the energy transport and then also the climate impact scanning. I think something that really strikes me is how much you try to understand actually the need of the local populations in the different districts and neighborhoods. And I think this is a very first step. It's a really great takeaway for us to see how you're leading in that front. And I'm really excited to see how this continues. Yes, maybe I stop here and open the floor to some immediate questions. We can go into a bit more of a reflection process in the second part, but maybe you have some immediate questions to Ollie at his presentation. Sebastian, please go ahead.
Sebastian.
Yeah, thank you so much, Oliver, for this insight. And I really love that neighborhood, climate safe neighborhood project. So maybe it's, I would like to go very deep inside, but I only have the main thing I thought is, how successful are you in getting in touch with the neighborhood, with the people you are? You just said you have workshops on 6 weeks with citizens, but so how, if you already have done some neighborhoods, how is the response of citizens, which maybe citizens which have been involved and also citizens which have not been involved? Do they also recognize the workshops? Because I think that's really a great way to go into that neighborhoods.
Yeah, good question, and a question whose answer is evolving, right? So with each iteration, I think we are getting better at reaching community members, and that's largely through other partnerships that we have in those communities. So when there is a relationship in the community, often they're more successful at bringing people to the table. I don't know how it is in your city, but there's not inherent trust between community members and government. So that is something we've had to work to build. I think I mentioned that we are paying community members to attend. So recognizing that their lived experience is a form of expertise on this area that we do not have, and we want to honor that and make the most of that. And that paid engagement has strengthened the follow through of the arrangement, so much so that many of the community members who have participated have then taken jobs with some of the community organizations that are helping support this work. So, it's helping to align skills and resources in a way that I don't think we saw at the outset. What we may have created, though, one of the problems that is emerging is that now all of the communities want this to happen in their community, right? And so while this is intended to be a community engagement equity effort, we've almost accidentally created something that's exclusive, just given the slowness of it. So we're talking through how to move faster and scale this in a way there where we could have more of these conversations in a given time frame. Then I guess the other big piece of it is the follow through, right? So they've developed these maps, and I'm sure you've seen maps that are developed like this and then nothing happens. We're working very hard to now work with urban forestry to plant trees in those places, work with SORTA to apply for our regional transit authority to apply for grants to put those bus shelters in. So trying to be a conduit to other climate access resources that the community may or may not have had the capacity or awareness of to pursue.
Thanks, Ollie. I think this is something that we can also take away from, really good experience on the ground, and what you said about the focus on some districts, and that then there is a question how to roll that out. I think that's also something where we come back to and ask you a little bit later how that has played out. Colin, you also raised your hand.
Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks, Oliver. That was a really good presentation. I've probably got a couple of questions to put things in context for me a wee bit. Like Sebastian says about the participation, I think that's one of the issues that we have in Glasgow. We've got people who are already invested in the conversation and will turn up at the drop of a hat. They'll be there every time. Yeah. But it's getting people that you don't have that connection with to participate is one of our biggest problems. So we also found that we did a community conversation, and we incentivized it as well by paying people to attend, and it was very well attended and it was well received. So I think the incentivization of it, I think it definitely is something we need to look into going forward for ourselves. Just to put it into context for me, what kind of size of population? Is it a city-wide remit you've got, or is it like a much broader kind of regional aspect that you cover?
So I work for the city of Cincinnati. Our city proper population is 310,000.
Right.
We have a metro of 2.2 million. We're in a county of 800,000. So when we pass policy, it's for that 300,000. But when we pass a sales tax levy, it's for that 800,000, and it impacts a much larger population.
Right. Okay. So that's similar to Glasgow then. We're slightly bigger as a population, but we've got the same regional population there. And the other thing is, when you talk about public transport, is your public transport regulated? Is it privatized, or is it held by the city?
It's public. It's jointly owned. So it's represented by a board that receives appointments from the county and the municipalities. So quasi-governmental might be the word to use.
Right. Okay. Okay. Ours is deregulated, so it's almost privatized. And we find it very difficult to influence the public transport systems. You're talking about it's difficult for some people to get to work, the numbers you're talking about, not being able to have that transport link. We're similar regarding transport links, because they go on the profitable route, they don't go on the route that needs a service, so that's one of our issues.
So if I could quickly comment on that, I've framed this as an equity issue. If I add more color to it, Amazon did a big HQ2 campaign in America, where they asked cities to put forward their most competitive offers to attract their big hub. And I think virtually every major city in the US put forward a package to try to attract, I think it was something like 50,000 jobs to their region. And we were not selected. And in the feedback, the two major points were, one, you don't have sufficient tech skills in your region to support this work. And two, you don't have a public transit system that could support this influx of residents. So that catalyzed our business community to organize a campaign around what it would take to expand our public transit. So we sort of simultaneously had a grassroots effort saying we need a better bus system. This isn't working for the people who rely on it. And our business leadership, our Chamber of Commerce, coming together and made for a coalition like one we haven't often seen, that passed a sales tax levy that has never been passed in 100 years, right? So it was a very momentous swing for us in a moment when ridership had been declining every year for the last 20 years. And it was, you probably heard the spiral of death analysis for public transit, with Uber and Lyft coming in and providing privatized, more efficient transportation. There was a concern that this would kill public transit as we know it. And instead, we've stood up this giant investment in the future of the region.
Thanks, that's brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ollie. I think I would like to give the word now to Sebastian and our second intervention of the day. Really great to have you, and we can come back to some of the questions maybe in the discussion part of the section today. So Sebastian, without further ado, we're really excited to hear about you and how nature-based solutions or green infrastructure development is relevant from the perspective of Ruhr. And maybe you could also give us a little bit of an introduction on your transition from the city of Essen. The floor is yours.
Yeah, sure. So thank you very much, Rebecca, that I have the spontaneous opportunity to present here. So I brought only a short presentation about Ruhr because I have the slides and I am just not too deep in the topic, but I think it fits quite well. We will have a slightly more regional perspective. And thanks, Oliver, very much for your neighborhood idea. So I will get back to you on that for sure. So we have, I changed my position from the city of Essen just 1 month ago, and we developed a project called the Landscape Laboratory of Ruhr Metropolis. It's taking the city planning perspective from the green and nature side on a regional dimension. And I also am now in charge of initiative. It's called Baukultur North Rhine-Westphalia, and I'm leading there the green cities and region. How you say chapter or the topic, project and topic leader of green cities and region in North Rhine-Westphalia. This is a state-driven initiative for a building culture or built environment culture. Baukultur, it's in German. And this word, I think, is somehow also used in English context. So I will start my presentation. Let's try. So it should work. So Ruhr is means landscape laboratory or landscape and architecture laboratory, and the Ruhr Metropolis is a city region, is a city of cities. Most of you maybe heard of it. It's a region which has some rivers, and it's mainly the Ruhr River is the name giver. It's here in the south of the map. the Emscher River you see here, and the Rhine River, maybe you heard of it, is passing here. And so this region is the landscape we are talking about, and it's today one of the highest dense populated areas, metropolitan areas of Europe, with 5 million people living. And it's heavily industrialized, and so this landscape is our topic, because we say we have to work out that that ecosystem service to have a region which is livable for everybody. Everybody can stay here even in the next generation. So this is the beautiful view. If we have a look on our region from Zeche Zollverein here, you see lots of trees, and but it has different perspectives and different sides of built environment and green combinations. So people live in rental houses, in old houses, in we have climate change. So this is also happening. This is 2014 heavy storm. We had drought. We have heavy rainfalls, forest fires, even in the urban areas. So that is why we say this think landscape approach is very important to rethink our cities. And so how can we find everybody who wants, who has to be involved in that topics? How can we bring people together, and where do we have to start with rethinking our cities? So these streets, maybe Stefan, you know, it's in Gelsenkirchen, Bochumer Straße, and so there are so many places which have no trees, which have old houses, which have lots of traffic, and which suffer the most. So there is a huge gap between people who live in green areas and with lots of trees, and they also are the most strong voices if there is something wrong with their trees. They call the administration, but there are so many people living in other areas where there is a lack of green. And we have lots of different perspectives on that. So people can have so many different connections to green in their city. And we're also trying to have a network, stronger network between people, but also between institutions. So we try to bring people from many different levels together, to work together, to discuss together, and to find solutions together. And we found that statement fits in very well. We said, so everybody has a different understanding of the green in the city, so everybody can take the responsibility for it, because we want to bring together that as many perspectives and stakeholders as we can. And that's the motto of the things we want to bring together. Should be like the next big thing from the people's perspective. And we will have an event this year. So there will be the Biennial of Urban Landscape in Ruhrgebiet in September, where we are working on at the moment very hard to set it up and to find some more fundings and stakeholders and partners. And so that's really a great step for our initiative to have the possibility to bring this to an event. It will be in Gelsenkirchen, in a place where in Gelsenkirchen-Uckendorf. It will happen at the Science Park, where Stefan Rath is also based. And we will also connect to neighborhoods. We will work with students here, and we will have this 14 days event on a green city transformation of the region. So this is the thing we are working on. I am working on like most of my time, but to connect back to the neighborhoods, I want to just have a short view on a project we had. We started in Essen. It was called Trans City, and I'm not up to date, Rebecca, but you asked me if I can introduce it a bit. So the Trans City project has the idea that there should be a connection between neighborhoods which have a different kind of, a bit different level of quality of life. So people in higher dense neighborhoods have less trees and they suffer more and they have less money and they have less voice, even if there is coming to decisions in politics and administrations. And but if you see at the climate budget and the emissions they produce, they are much better in protect our climate, because they people who have less money consume less, drive less with cars, buy less newer cars. So these are really the people who are helping the climate much more than people who have a huge new electric car and go to the eco superstore every day. So we try to bring that together and to define find a way how to define the footprint, the CO2 footprint of people, and then to find a way how to interchange between these different lifestyles. Yeah, it's called TransCity, and it's driven by 2 universities with the research part. And in the end, the idea was to find a way how to make a exchange on that CO2 budget, so that people can share or come closer together in their lifestyles and health and environment by having a profit from less CO2 emission, which is really helpful for all of us. So I can't go deeper in that because I was not able to prepare, but you're very welcome to join us, Lala Ruhr and Green Cities and Regions, and we will have a website soon on our biennial and set up a program, and it will be in September.
Thank you so much, Sebastian, for coming in today and for also giving an insight on both on the Lala Ruhr and the biennial and what you have in mind there, and also a glimpse of the TransCity project. I think 2 things strike me in particular. One is the collaboration aspect and the small things that you're referring to, both in terms of maybe taking small steps to make bigger action happen, but also to, you know, make sure that every voice is reflected, not only the bigger players, but that co-creation or collaboration means that also smaller voices that are usually not heard can be heard. So I'm really excited to then see the program develop, and we'll be really happy to also see the website once it's open. And then on the TransCity project, I just wanted to emphasize that I also think it's a very interesting approach, since I think the first webinar that we had in our second round of the Transitions Alliance project, I'm not sure if all of you remember, where we had every city taking a turn and presenting a little bit on their respective equity work. It struck me in particular from Cincinnati and Baltimore that you both used maps to kind of showcase only a little bit of that you showed in your presentation today as well, in terms of heat islands, tree canopies, other factors. I think there was also income in one of the maps for Baltimore, and always the maps showed a very similar pattern. So since then, I'm thinking a little bit about the geographic approach and yeah, the question of how we can actually channel investments and benefits of climate interventions to communities that are maybe a little bit neglected sometimes. So I think the TransCity project there is an interesting first step to kind of understand a bit better how can be not only like a balancing, but also a conversation between different neighborhoods. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, that the idea is that the kind of the benefits or the outcomes in terms of investments would then be used to increase green infrastructure in the neighborhood that is has less of this. So kind of also there are then infrastructure investments benefiting the neighborhood that has need of those. Yes, so I think a really interesting approaches that you showed us today. I again want to open the floor to questions from the group or comments. Yes, Colin, please go ahead.
Hi, Sebastian. Thanks for that. See the later slide, there was something about a CO2 certificate. What was the reason behind the image there? Is there a policy about CO2 certificates or something?
So the idea of the Trans-City CO2 balancing was just to highlight that there is such a huge gap between different lifestyles and neighborhoods in causing CO2 emissions, which is not really, which nobody is really aware of. And so that this can also be like something, because we need more people which have less CO2 emission. So to have less CO2 emission should be something very good. And not something people are suffering on because they have no money and nothing to buy. So that was the idea. They set up this research project on that. And it's not based on the certificate regulations.
Okay. I was just wondering if it could be applied to industry in some capacity to try and encourage a cleaner type of business model. You know, if that was something that you'd considered, whether it could be like a penalty, you know, if it goes over a certain target.
Yeah, the idea is to set up something like trading the CO2 emissions, but there is just the idea. So they are now in the research phase of that project. And they try to find 4,000 citizens which give their CO2 footprint in with a mobile phone app. So they will track the CO2 emissions with 4,000 citizens from each neighborhoods, and then they find out how it really is, how they can evaluate it and how they can use it in that exchange between the neighborhoods. Like a first research on that.
Okay, thank you.
Sebastian, I love the image of the next big thing is a bunch of little things. I have a question about the culture of change. Here, there's a very common detachment from climate change from individuals where they'll say, you know, it doesn't matter what we do as individuals. 70% of the world's carbon emissions come from 100 companies. We need them to act. And it sort of disowns any role in the climate crisis. How do you relate to that? Is that similar in the Ruhr region?
Yeah, what we want to relate to is like a personal benefit from making things better. So we are not saying don't drive car or don't buy anything. So we try to set up a great vision of the future. So like we have now one program point is called the future as well. So we have, if we have a green city which is resilient, which is just, which is productive, which is giving us trees, giving us shade in the summer, and if we go out of the door, there's not too much traffic. There's just space for children to walk around, and people are able to cycle where they can, not depending on their age or on their ability or on their money. So that's something we can be very happy heading to, and that's what we want to have, like people coming together, discussing things, find solutions, and they say, yeah, let's go. That's really we can do things much better than we do now, and don't be afraid of losing something or discussing all the time about parking spaces, or don't find the way to the from A to B if there's parking too expensive, or if so. That's how we are how we want to set up the scene. And what we also want to have is like bringing people together who have an interest somehow, and to give them the chance to participate. And if this is a bird lover, or people who love mountain biking or just walking, or if they say we are city planners or architects or head of administration, or students from university, or urban gardeners, or anybody can just has an interest and has expertise. And also I love that really much in you, what you said, that you really use the expertise of citizens of their neighborhood, because that's really the most step to take if participating, involving people in that governmental administration processes. Because usually I experience administration is always knows everything anyway better.
I only say that because you're not with administration anymore.
Yes, now I can say.
Thank you, Sebastian. I think what you said about the neighborhoods and the vision you have is already a great transition to our third intervention today. So let me very warmly welcome my colleague Matthew Bach from ICLEI Europe. Without further ado, actually, I would like to give you the floor and invite you to also share your screen. We might need to do some technical points for that, but maybe you can introduce yourself, and then we are trying to see to that while we're doing that.
Great, thanks a lot, Rebecca. And I hope you can hear me all right. Yeah, really interesting to hear about that. And I really liked Sebastian's presentation, and also what I caught of Oliver's. Sorry, I missed the beginning of it. I think I'm going to have a slightly different non-map based presentation, so I hope you'll forgive me for that. And for those of us in Europe, it's starting to be late in the day, so I'm also going to try and keep it relatively light, so that we can still have a bit of time to talk as well. Good. All right. All the computer stuff seems to be working all right. So yeah, I want to talk about some work we've done at ICLEI Europe, looking at how we can ensure that sustainability and justice go hand in hand. I think it goes without saying that there's a long history of environmental or kind of measures linked to the environment having negative impacts on vulnerable and marginalized groups. There has been also a long history of protest movements and activism to try and address that. The fact that John Oliver just came out with an episode on environmental racism still points to the need for much more work to be done. In Europe, we've had then the Yellow Vest movement as a response to an attempt to tax polluting, basically, car fuels. And even some of our supposed flagship initiatives, like the Bosco Verticale in Milan, have still come on to a backdrop of diminishing public space, privatization, disconnection of communities, and so on and so forth. So far from kind of the broader hero narrative that we like to have in the sustainable cities domain, we have still the potential to not do everything in the best way possible. So we need to work on this integration of sustainability and justice. So we had led a project called Urban Arenas for Sustainable and Just Cities. This project is now over, but the knowledge is still relevant. As part of it, we identified 10 drivers of injustice in the context of sustainability interventions. I'm not going to go through them in detail, but I think some of them probably ring a bell, like limited citizen participation, weakened civil society, racialized exclusionary urbanization, and so on and so forth. But what I want to talk about today is how do we actually go about ensuring this integration and moving forward. And to this end, we've developed 17 keys to look at how we can unlock sustainable and just cities. Now, I'm not going to go through every single one of them. That would take far too long. But I think I just want to give you a sense of how we got here, a little bit of what's in there. And then if you're interested, hopefully you'll be willing to explore further on the dedicated online platform that we've set up for this. The first thing to say is that this is not just the work of ICLEI, it's the work of a very large community of practice of over 1,000 city makers, primarily from Europe. And so I'd be remiss if we took all the credit. And we worked with them to try and look at what kind of approaches can be put into place, what are the drivers of injustice that this specific key addresses, inspirational examples, what kinds of governance arrangements can be deployed, and a whole set of resources. So what we've done then is try to, in a way, form a vision of what then a city that's both sustainable and just is. And so here, for example, I'll just go to the more detailed one, point to one key, and this is one of three that I'll focus on today, which is the question of participation. And I think we've heard some really good examples coming from all the speakers today. And there are more and more ways also through technology in different ways for then citizens to participate, especially those who do not tend to take part. But what's really important here is to ensure that this participation is not just a buzzword, and that it's not just, a tick box process. Those of you who run these processes also know how messy and difficult they can be, but trying to ensure that meaningful and genuine participation takes place is absolutely critical if we want to ensure inclusive and effective outcomes. The other thing has to do with accessibility, and this is very much about ensuring that everyone has access to the benefits of sustainability action. And that it's not just the leafy middle-class suburbs that get all the trees and the nice park with the adaptation measures and so on and so forth, but that they're equally spread. I mean, what I think Oliver was saying about the disparities in heat, and I think there are also some similar studies that came out of Portland with really significant results. I think these are the kinds of things that we need to ensure, but it's not just a physical issue. It's also an economic one. So who can afford to have access to what? It's also one of knowledge. Can people even actually understand what's being communicated or what's being provided? Whether it's a question of specific, like which actual language or the way in which it's written, and even also a political one. So is there transparency put in place, measures to ensure that everyone has access to the information, the knowledge, and the benefits that are out there? The last thing I want to bring up today is something that is unfortunately often overlooked by those of us working in the domain of sustainable cities, and that has to do with power. So we kind of take it as a given and try to work in this apoliticized, power-driven sphere. But we really have to look at how we can make harmful power relations explicit, how we can try to adapt them and basically deconstruct them and build more positive power relations. And this is really important because unless all residents in an urban domain become able to participate, become empowered to be part of these processes, then the solutions that we'll come to will remain imperfect. So just in an attempt to try and bridge the gap between the three dimensions of the Urban Transitions Alliance and these 17 keys, I think we are in any case very much on board with these three dimensions. We think these are three really important elements. The fact that participation, I think absolutely critical. And then part of participation comes also questions of diversity. How can we strengthen civil society? But also, how can we ensure that responsibility is taken for action? So it's not just a matter of ensuring participation, but also one of having a shared form of responsibility. And then in terms of access, then this includes then the questions I mentioned regarding nature, knowledge, accessibility more broadly, learning also in a way between localities so that there's access to knowledge commons, and above that, even I would say power. And then in terms of opportunity, this is really important in terms of rethinking the economy. I thought it was interesting that Oliver brought up the case of Amazon's second headquarters and kind of how significant an impact that had. But more broadly, I think it's important for us to look at how cities can try to foster a broader and more kind of inclusive economy, one that's not simply powered by GDP growth, but that's also powered by values such as solidarity, fairness, and so on and so forth. Also then taking into account things like the regional system. So how does the city and its broader region, how do they work together? How do the measures put in place in one part of that system impact the other part? I think that's particularly well done then in the case of the Ruhr region, where they've really done that actually really super impressive work around the Emscher River, well, or canal / river, I guess. Yeah, I could go on, but I just thought that those were a few then reflections, and hopefully we can have a bit more of a conversation. Oh, and sorry, the promo bit. Feel free to visit our website. There's lots of stuff on there, videos and so on and so forth. And I'd be happy if you also feel like reaching out later to give you more information.
Thank you so much, Matthew. And I think it was really striking to see how many overlaps we actually have, although sometimes the framing or the grouping might be a little bit different. But I think across all presentations, but also all the work that we had in the UTA with that framework and in relation to equity, I think there are a lot of overlaps with what you just emphasized. And thank you also for making this selection, which really goes in line with what we have on the agenda to discuss today. I think the how is the very critical part in terms of making these, necessary, I don't think I have the right word, but yeah, kind of, I think we're agreeing on what we need to achieve and what are kind of the big themes we're working in, but the how in practice on the ground is, I think, what is really, yeah, the critical part. And I think from the different examples from the cities, from Cincinnati and Essen today, but also from others, we have seen already very interesting examples that have a lot of details. And I think very often the devil is in the detail if it comes to power relations or if it comes to participation. And I think we can all agree that we should be very inclusive and we should empower everybody to participate. But what Ollie has already said, or Sebastian has touched on, is how do we actually make that happen, that every community member that has something to say is actually heard. We heard already that financial incentive can be something that is a good way forward. So yeah, maybe I again stop here. I would really encourage all of us in the discussion now to come forward and address the how with like ideas and examples from the respective cities. But maybe first I again open the floor for questions directly to Matthew in this presentation. Nina from Turku, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all for the great presentations. I mean, I can't tell you how inspiring this has been, and especially also my question already from after Oliver's presentation would have been that how did you engage the people? Because this is of course always the problem, and similarly to what Colin said, that we also, if we get people to the workshops, they are always the same faces. It's of course wonderful to have people who are very, very engaged and always come again and again, but we see that there's a problem if we don't get new people there too, because then it's not participation. And this is very new idea that that economic incentive would be a good way, but it really sounds very promising, and I think I'm going to remember this very well. Also, we have used our networks, like for example, with we have this network called Vastu, which is for the business sector in our region, and when we have a workshop, we often do it with Vastu, so we get a lot of expertise from the business sector too, because sometimes they are in the core of how to make things go forward. But of course, if we try to get the citizens participated, then it's a different approach. And for example, in our student village, where where we are doing this energy positive region, a city district, we need to have the citizens, the students participated. And we have a group of mentors in the project, and they are the means to reach the citizens there. They also live in there, but they help us in many ways trying to. So I see that it often takes someone in between the city and the citizens. Thank you. And this is really cleared up my own ideas. I don't have any particular question anymore, but yeah, really nice to hear these examples.
Thank you so much, Nina, for sharing your reflection. And I think the mentoring is also something really interesting that we can take away. I think Colin already raised your hand. Please, come in.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Matthew. That was really interesting. I would really like to see those slides. I'd really like to get a copy of them. They were really good. We've just embarked on a city portrait using the donut economics, and we undertook a workshop very recently, trying to cover a lot of what you identified in the 17 key features. We tried to use the kind of local and global aspects of what we can do as a city organisation, and to understand our impact in a global scale as well as a local scale. So yeah, I think it all kind of knits together, and it'd be something that I'd be really quite interested to maybe use to maybe integrate that into the next workshop that we do with our elected representatives, because I think especially around power, I think they would be quite interested in how they distribute that power to their own citizens and their own electorate. So it's something I would quite like to maybe discuss further with you.
Yeah, that'd be great. And by the way, I think the donut folks and us on this point are quite close. Actually, Kate was quite an inspiration for the project. So I'm very happy. I think Rebecca can probably attach the slides afterwards, because I think she has a PDF. But I'm also really happy if you get in touch. I'll send you my email address, and happy to have a chat as well. And congratulations on engaging in the city portrait process. I hear really good things about it.
Yeah, it's very early stages. I see Oliver just asked about if we completed our profile, but we've got a year to go, so we've still got around another 5 sets of stakeholder engagement workshops to go through, to really try and dig into what is required for the city to identify a kind of baseline at the moment. So we've still got a journey to go on it, but it's really exciting to begin with.
Thank you, Colin. And I think we're all quite excited to see then the outcomes of this process in a year. I have Sebastian with a raised hand, and afterwards Inju. So please, Sebastian.
Yeah, thank you, Matthew, for that great summarization of that topic. I want to just add one thought, which also came up in the discussion we had in that UTA challenge process. With the focus on health and with the focus on passive health. So people who live in a street which has lots of traffic and air pollution, so they mostly have cheap rents. So why do they live there? Because they have no choice. And so if they have a benefit from less traffic, less speed of the traffic, cleaner air, more trees, children can go out of the door and just run around and be safe. So that will be like a passive benefit, which is not, they don't really have to know about it or be aware of it. They just will benefit from it. And what Susanne Möbus also in that, she is making public health research, and she was pointing it out that these people who have this health impact on that unaware level, so they will have it much harder in so many other steps to go in their life, because they are just affected that much on that level already. So if there is also a huge potential to raise without telling the people. So there is not all, so participation and collaboration is very important, but there is also a lot of things we can do without even letting that people know about it, because they just breathe air and they just live life and they just go out the door. And even if the park is very beautiful and the park is very accessible and it's just 1,000 meters away, it's too far for them, because they stay in their home and children just go in front of the door and air is polluted when they open the window. So there is also one thing we have to be aware of, I think. And I just wanted to drop that thought on that great collection of points you did on that. Maybe you also already thought on it, but it just came up to my mind.
I guess that's a question that everyone is probably grappling with. Thanks, Sebastian. I mean, I agree in a sense that there are certain things that deliver certain measures that deliver environmental benefits, regardless of whether or not you engage with residents. At the same time, if you want, I would still think that if you want to ensure that measures or broader measures have popular support, so for example, that the local residents actually use the park rather than just having the kids play in front of the door next to the street, or things like that, that this kind of broader engagement may be useful, but it's still, I think it is at the same time important to recognize that you can't engage for absolutely everything all the time, in the sense that there are limitations purely of a practical nature, in the sense that true engagement is really messy, is really time consuming, really resource intensive, and also residents develop some form of fatigue after a while, where if you keep asking them to participate in everything, oftentimes we've heard from officials that they don't get the same turnout, the same buy-in. And I think but then this becomes a question more about what are the kinds of governance processes that we put in place. And here I think there are a lot of interesting models that are out there, the climate assemblies, various participatory budgets, and so on and so forth, different ways of ensuring that we can get people to participate and to be involved without making it something particularly heavy. And there, of course, then the question of how to ensure that this is representative and so on and so forth is particularly difficult, of course.
Thanks, Matthew. And I think the question of relevance is also something that is guiding us there, in terms of making sure that the people that are actually affected are involved, or that, you know, policies are based on the needs of those who are affected by it. And I think some of this, I always come back to the presentation that Ollie gave initially, in terms of deciding also in making ensuring that policy is actually based on the need. So we saw some interesting insights how this can be done there. Now I have Unju and then Colin afterwards. Unju, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you all the speakers. Can you hear me?
Unju, I don't think we can hear you clearly.
Is this better?
Yeah.
First, thank you all the speakers for your wonderful sharing. And my question is to Matteo about the 3 dimensions and 70 keys, because one of the questions is about the monitoring. So I'm wondering that if those 3 dimensions and 70 keys are the monitoring framework for the equity from the project from ICLEI Europe. And if yes, does each of them have sub-indicators, or those of them only the principle or the goal?
Thanks. Well, you're actually getting us to what we'd like to do after or with these keys. So the keys themselves don't have any indicators as of now. And one of the things that we want to do, and that we're in the process of trying to get some funding for, is to turn this into a proper assessment framework. So where with detailed indicators, how to use it and so on, so that can become also a tool for local governments and their stakeholders to actually understand how they are doing in terms of the integration of sustainability and justice in their cities. But this is quite a challenging undertaking in the sense that it links very closely to societal dynamics that are often very place-based. So yeah, we're not quite there yet, but this is definitely an element that we'd like to work on. So thank you for your question.
Thanks, Matthew. And I think after Colin's question, I would like to invite Ollie to share some of the work on the climate equity indicators that Cincinnati is doing that could be then of interest also for our monitoring question. But maybe Colin, we have your question first.
I suppose it's not really a question, it's more a kind of observation from some of the work that we've been doing, and some of the points have been raised by Oliver, Sebastian and Matthew. I suppose, the ideas around social justice and climate justice are really closely connected when you hear the discussions today. And I suppose that brings into, sharp focus, something that I was discussing earlier on in a workshop. We were discussing food waste. And one of the things that came up in the discussion was that it probably is, it's really quite easy for people who are middle class in a kind of class-based system to engage with sustainability, but people who are in like the lower working class areas, it's much more difficult for them to really engage with sustainability itself. Things around, just the cost and the effort that's needed, and some of the education behind it as well. It can be really quite difficult for people in lower income families to really engage with sustainable choices. And I suppose that feeds into the equitable aspect of the discussion today. And the final thing I wanted to say was, today we've got local elections in Glasgow. So this is like a huge day for democracy, and some of the districts are returning 9, 10, 12%, voting returns just now, which is really, really low. The participation aspect of, local politics needs to be much higher in people's, they need to have much more importance to people. And I don't think they realise how important it is to them. And they can complain about services, etc., and not reaching them. But if they don't have a voice and they don't make that voice heard, the democratisation of the city needs to be much broader than it already is. So that's a couple of points that just from today. Thanks.
Thanks, Colin, for the reflection. And I think you would agree. And I think the question of how to activate people a bit more also for the democratic processes is a very, very big question just opening there. And yeah, I think that will be with us for a while to come as well. Ollie, I would like to, as I mentioned, ask you a little bit to give us an idea of what you've been doing on the equity indicators. To also come back to the question that Unju had in terms of the monitoring and how we can actually measure progress in these areas that we talked about.
Yeah, before I answer that, I just want to say, Matthew, I love that presentation and the framing and the storytelling in it. I think that's one of the big challenges now, is how to talk about these topics in a way that resonates. And that was very well done. I'm going to share a link to the report if you'd like to dive in. It is 300 and some pages, be forewarned. So we look at 55 different metrics at a neighborhood level. And I guess first and foremost, I want to say we're moving away from citywide metrics to disaggregated neighborhood or census block metrics. And the more specific we can be, it's this household, this block, this census tract, the more intentional we can be about targeting our programs and resources. So a lot of this is what data sets are available. And that was our starting point. So I already talked about some of the big climate vulnerabilities. In Cincinnati, those look like heat emergencies. Those look like flash flooding and sewer backups. And increasingly asthma attacks as it relates to air quality issues. And when you look at the health outcomes, we're looking at a 25-year difference in life expectancy from one neighborhood to another. So pretty profound differences. And how can we tease those apart in terms of how much are they driven by economics and poverty, access to healthy foods, access to good work, or risks, living in proximity to highways and the particulate matter generated from tailpipe emissions. We look at the language you speak and how accessible city programs are. We look at age demographics. Are there clusters of populations living, populations of people older than 65 living in certain pockets of the city, and how do those correlate to heat risks? Who has air conditioning, who does not? Who has a car, who does not? What is the percentage rental population? What is the percentage homeownership? And then maybe one of the more nuanced categories is community empowerment. I mentioned we have 52 different neighborhoods. Some of them have very high functioning community councils or church groups or community development corporations, a centralized body that represents the community and advocates and works on their behalf. And when we have those organizations, we find that the community is better at accessing governmental resources. So that is somewhat subjective in its scoring and somewhat network mapping based. When we know a community has a community council, when we know there's a strong church presence, et cetera, it's less, API data stream. It's more qualitative. And then you can compare different data sets, right? So how do the risks align with the vulnerabilities? And sometimes you have a high risk neighborhood that is actually pretty well prepared to endure the challenge. If you have high heat, but you have high rates of home ownership, high rates of air conditioning, that's less of a risk than maybe a community that's experiencing less heat, but has no air conditioning and has limited access to green space or public pool access. So I'm speaking in fairly broad strokes, but I think it gives you a sense of how we're thinking about this and how we would like to begin to track some of these equity metrics.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And I think I speak for everybody that this is really exciting and interesting work. And the more that the tracking will show some outcomes, will also be really interesting to see those. And I think with data, there is so much potential, but it's a lot of work, as we know, and big questions around like how to use them, how to compare, and how to collect. So yeah, it will be really interesting, and we'll look into the link that you shared as well. With an eye to the time, maybe I would like to ask Ing to pull back up the presentation. I think I would like to stop here. I'll follow up by email with the presentation, at least from Matthew. If the other two would like to send them to me, I'm also happy to share those then with the group afterwards. And just to say that some of the content that was shared here and in the other webinars of the series will be taken up in a publication that we're developing together with Circular Turku. So if some of the examples that you shared will be taken, we'll be in touch with you to verify information and yeah, make sure all is good. Sorry about that. Yeah, I think I can just say that I'm excited that most of us will meet next week at the World Congress in Malmö. Also Matthew will be there. So we'll also have the opportunity to continue that conversation that we had today. Once more, I thank you very warmly, Ollie, Sebastian, and Matthew for presenting, but also thank you to everybody else for participating in the discussion. Yes, that was a really great journey with having this webinar series, but we'll have more Transitions Alliance related conversations to come. So I'm also excited for those. For now, I'd like to end the meeting here. Thanks to you all, and a good rest to your morning or afternoon or evening, and see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.
See you soon.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.